this here. Okay. So, and thanks everybody for muting yourselves so that way when I'm talking, if your dog barks, which mine might, by the way, apologies in advance, it doesn't like jump to you and throw off the recording. And I'll just I made a PowerPoint, and so I'll just go through that, then I'll open up some space for talking. Let me share my screen. Okie doke. Here we go. Slideshow from beginning. Okay. So a lot of you have been reaching out to me, and a lot of your kids have been reaching out to me, which is why I'm going to do this again on Sunday, on the Israeli, what exactly is going on right now in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I'm going to sum it up as best as I can. I see a few people on here, like I'm way too much of an Israel news junkie, and I see folks on here like Ron and Laura and Matthew who are way more Israel news junkies than I am, could probably tell you even more than I could. But I'm going to do the best I can to sum it up and share my opinions as I understand them. So a couple of things of what we're doing tonight, just as a sort of summary, is we're hearing what is happening as best as I can describe it. And like I said, I'm going to share my opinions. And I want to say I'm sorry in advance, because inevitably all of you are going to agree with me in some ways and disagree with me in some ways. As you might know, I'm a fairly opinionated individual, and I kind of think of myself as a centrist. If I were president of the United States, I think I'd be an independent and would probably have a Democrat head of the EPA and Democrat head of education and some other things, and have a Republican Secretary of State and Republican Secretary of Defense. That it like depends on the issue, whether I'm more conservative or more, I almost said more reform, more liberal. And so I'm going to just give my opinions tonight as I understand them. And because of time constraints and stuff, I have a board meeting at 7. I'll just say I've had a lot of folks who have called me in tears this week, saying, especially after that horrible vandalism that happened at the Chabad Center, who are saying this is a tough week to be Jewish. And it is. I mean, the reason we're all here is, you know, whether we agree with Israel or we don't, we feel a special connection to Israel. You know, I wasn't holding anything a couple months ago to talk about the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict. We feel a special relationship to Israel. So I don't think we'll have the time or space for us to get in arguments. And I understand some of you have shared the link tonight with your coworkers and friends who maybe aren't a part of the Jewish community or aren't a part of Cole and me, and that's fine. You're welcome to be here to hear my opinion and everything, but I could just see it turning into a kind of a mess if everybody then starts debating with each other. So that's not what we're going to do tonight. After I present, I just want to open it up for people to be able to share how they're feeling, how they're doing, how we can support each other. And if you want to have a debate, or if you think I got tonight totally wrong, please, by all means, feel free to have your own event called What Rabbi Spector Got Wrong. And I'm sure it will be well attended and you can share your viewpoints and such. So let's kind of start, like, I'm not going to go through the entire Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but let's start off with what happened, what's happening right now with this particular conflict. And a lot of it started around a neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah, which is a neighborhood I've spent a lot of time in East Jerusalem. It's kind of like right next to Damascus Gate area, if you've been to East Jerusalem. And with this land, it's of particular importance to some Jewish people because it contains the tomb of Shimon the Righteous, which you can see right here. And so in 1876, there were religious Jews who purchased certain pieces of the land in the neighborhood that's today called Sheikh Jarrah. And in 1891, homes for poor Yemenite Jews were built there. And Jews lived in these homes and owned these homes and such. Well, fast forward about 50 something years. And in 1948, uh, there were 100 Jewish homes in the neighborhood about. And in March 1948, the British started to expel Jews and ask them to leave. And during the War of Independence, East Jerusalem and what we today call West Bank, or some people might call it Judea and Samaria, depending on your views, was captured by Jordan, and the remaining Jews there were expelled. So what happened also on the Palestinian side? So a Palestinian diaspora took place during the War of Independence. During the War of Independence, 85% of the Arab population of what is today Israel became largely displaced for various reasons. Now, I grew up kind of hearing how, well, they all left, and some of my friends who have very different viewpoints than me heard, oh, Israel kicked them all out of their homes. And the more I've researched, the more the truth is kind of in the middle. I won't go into all of this, but a lot of Palestinians were kicked out of their homes actually by Arab armies that were and militias that were attacking Jewish groups, and some of them were indeed kicked out by Zionist Jewish groups that were fighting for independence for the state of Israel. And then, but a lot of these Arabs also left because they said, I'm leaving the conflict, I'm going to, oh, I gotta let my dog out one second. Anyhow, sorry, forgot to open. So anyways, a lot of these people, though, left because they said we want to leave the violence, or they left as well because they heard misinformation by the Arab armies who wanted to really put fear into them and say, look how horrible the Zionists are. They are slaughtering and killing and all these things. And a lot of it was greatly exaggerated, and it backfired on them because this caused people to flee. So there are a variety of reasons people left. And this number 85%, that's just a number I have heard. There's a lot of arguments about all these numbers. But most of these folks, some of these folks go to Gaza. Some leave the area, go to Syria, Lebanon, etc. But most of them go to East Jerusalem and the West Bank and Jordan, all of which at the time was a part of Jordan. And in 1956, Jordan settles along with the United Nations Refugee Committee 28 of these families into these homes once lived in by Jews. Well, let's fast forward another 11 years. And what happens? The 6-Day War happens. And in 6 days, Israel has this remarkable victory in which they capture East Jerusalem, and the Palestinians who live there come under Israeli control. And that includes the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. So let's talk a little bit about Sheikh Jarrah. I'm not sure, I couldn't find the exact population of what Sheikh Jarrah is. Things I was finding online said like a few thousand, but I know Sheikh Jarrah is a pretty big neighborhood, but it's a fairly important place. It's kind of where like the bus station is that takes the buses to the various Palestinian towns in the West Bank and such. And it's considered a center for Arab commerce in East Jerusalem. And today, East Jerusalem has about 450,000 individuals living in it, and about 250,000 are Palestinian Arabs. and another 200,000 or so are Israeli Jews. So it's almost like 50-50 in terms of Arab population and Israeli Jewish population. Now, there are some challenges, though, for the Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem. And I'll be honest about some of those challenges. Um, they Israel, as do I, considers East Jerusalem to be a part of Jerusalem, the unified capital of the state of Israel, and a part of Israel proper. And as a result, it's treated differently than other Palestinian towns in the West Bank, like Ramallah and Bethlehem, Nablus, Jericho, Jenin, Hebron, which are largely under Palestinian Authority control. And um, and so the challenges, though, is these folks who are living in East Jerusalem, they are living under Israel, in a part of Israel, but don't have Israeli citizenship, can't vote in Israeli elections and such. And there are reasons I support that, and there are reasons that I'm against that. It's a very complicated situation. And um, and also, though, one of the difficult things is what we see in neighborhoods like Sheikh Jarrah and others is evictions at times of Arab families who are not paying taxes, not paying rent, and so on and so forth, and who are perhaps squatting illegally. And on one hand, that makes total sense that they would be evicted and stuff if you aren't paying taxes, if you aren't paying your rent, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, critics of Israel will point out that it can be a lot more challenging for a Palestinian to legally purchase land than a Jewish person. Um, and so there, it can be difficult. So let's go to this particular conflict, though. So, like I said, 1967, Israel captures and reunifies the city of Jerusalem, and Sheikh Jarrah becomes a part of Israel. And in 1972, Jewish groups that had owned that land, they want it back, naturally and understandably, I think. Like if my family had purchased land in the 1800s and lived in homes, and then they were expelled in 1948, and then 20 years later, that land became part of my country again, I would say I have a deed to that land. My family purchased that land. That belongs to me. And at the same time, though, I understand where the Palestinians who are living in those places are coming from, because they say, "What do you mean? We were told to move into these properties by the Jordanian government and such, and we haven't had to pay rent. And how is it all of a sudden, like if I have this wonderful home I live in, and if somebody were to tell me, that was actually belonged to my family 20 years ago, you need to start paying me rent because it's mine," I'd say you're out of your mind. And so I understand both sides of the coin here. And this was brought to court, and the courts eventually decided that this land is Jewish, is belongs to the Jewish people and their descendants who purchased it. And in 2008, Palestinian families living in these homes are ordered to pay rent and fight this, and have been fighting this for really for decades, but more so over the last 12 years. And the Israeli courts this past fall ordered that if these people are not paying rent, that they need to be evicted. Because if the courts rule somebody else owns that land and you're a tenant, you need to pay rent. That's understandable. And so in late April 2021, mid-late April, evictions start to take place for 13 families. And this is kind of what starts some of these protests. And the timing of it, though, was very awkward because it also happened to be taking place during Ramadan, the holiest month of the year for Muslims. And so protests occur, and Israeli police raid Haram al-Sharif, the Dome of the Rock, on April 13th, and cut the speakers of the cables during the service there, as President Rivlin was giving a speech at the Western Wall. And at this time, too, Israel closed Damascus Gate. The Israeli police closed Damascus Gate for 2 weeks, which is where the Muslims generally come in from. And thousands of Muslim worshipers are turned away from praying during Ramadan. And so this creates some protests and tensions, and clashes between the Arab Muslims of these neighborhoods and the Israeli police. And unfortunately, as often happens, we see on both sides extremists start to inflame tensions. On one hand, a TikTok sensation among Palestinians started to go viral of Palestinians going and slapping Jewish people across the face and assaulting Jewish people. And at the same time, an event that occurred within the last couple of weeks was Jerusalem Day, which is a day that celebrates the reunification of the city of Jerusalem. Well, that's how I see it, as a celebration. But obviously, for Palestinians, they do not see this as a day of celebration. They see it as a day of mourning, a tremendous loss for them. And 2 years ago, I was in Jerusalem for Jerusalem Day, which I always love to be in Jerusalem for Jerusalem Day, because there's so many wonderful festivities taking place at the Western Wall and all over Jerusalem and stuff. But there's also always something unfortunate that occurs. And that's that certain extremist groups, Jewish extremist groups, march through the Muslim quarter of the old city, chanting stuff about how they're going to basically burn down the Dome of the Rock and rebuild the temple, and do that to be provocative and inflammatory. And so, there was a lot of concern of these things happening too. The Israeli police basically got closed Dome of the Damascus Gate, also for this reason, to try and prevent clashes from these folks. But it certainly inflamed tensions. Now, I didn't put a slide in as well, but we've seen, sadly, over the last couple of weeks, as there have been increased violence, we've seen kind of racial mobs on both sides in Israel committing acts of violence, largely, especially in a city called Lod, which is in central Israel. It's like where the Ben Gurion Airport actually is Lod. And there is a city that has a large Jewish population and a very large Israeli Arab population. And there have been some Jewish mob groups that attacked innocent Arab civilians, and at the same time, there have been Arab mobs that have firebombed synagogues in Lod and that have attacked Jewish civilians, Israeli civilians. And sadly, the other day, a Jewish man who got beaten up by one of these Arab mobs succumbed to his injuries and died. And so that's been very tragic, I think, and very traumatizing for a lot of Israelis to see, in particular, because a lot of Israelis, especially in towns like Haifa and Tel Aviv and other places and certain neighborhoods in Jerusalem, have had pretty good experiences of living side by side, like Jews and Arabs side by side, fairly peacefully and well. And seeing the tensions spill over like this has been difficult. And so, unfortunately, we start to see a lot of escalation. The Palestinians began rioting in the West Bank, and one Palestinian protester was shot and killed in Nablus, and Palestinian protesters were arrested. And then Hamas began to fire rockets. And this began there was one rocket that was fired like April 15th, but On April 23rd, Hamas fired 36 rockets at Israel. And and you can see here this map of the range of the rockets, Palestinian rockets, how far they can hit. Um, Sometimes these rockets are largely makeshift. They aren't the most professional rockets, and so sometimes they miss their marks and Hamas will launch a rocket and it won't even enter Israel. It will land in Gaza and hit the home of a Palestinian, kill Palestinians. And the media will report that Israel did this before they find out, no, actually it wasn't Israel. And uh, Hamas last week knocked out power to 250,000 of their own people by hitting a power line, a power center, with one of their own rockets that Israel had set up for the people of Gaza to be able to have electricity. But between May 10th and May 18th, Hamas fired 3,440 rockets at Israel. Imagine that. I mean, I'm not good at math. It's one of the reasons I'm a rabbi, but I can tell you that just from doing like simple math in my head, that's over 400 rockets a day being fired at Israel. And these rockets were largely reaching as well Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And so, I saw a video, unfortunately, of worshipers at the Western Wall uh, running for cover as an air raid siren was going off overhead. Now, fortunately, Israel has this incredible technology that is called Iron Dome. Um, and Iron Dome, uh, Iron Dome has been about 90% effective in what, in case you don't know what Iron Dome is, it's basically this technology where Israel can fire a rocket at an incoming rocket and intercept it and blow it up in the sky. It's incredible, game changer. And so it's 90% effective. Now, again, I'm bad at math, but if we take 90% of 3,500 rockets, that's remarkable numbers. And it still means that about 350 rockets, 400 rockets are landing in Israel. That's terrifying. And these rockets are fired indiscriminately and can uh, are meant to target just any Israeli civilians, Israeli homes and stuff. We saw sadly last week a 6-year-old boy who was killed by one of these rockets, and then at his funeral a couple days later, everybody had to run from the funeral because another air raid siren went off. And so despite the 90% effectiveness of these rockets, uh, hundreds have still been wounded. Over a dozen people in Israel have been killed. And by the way, like I said, these rockets are indiscriminate. So some of the people killed have been Israeli Arab Muslims, and also foreign workers from Thailand and India who came to make better lives for themselves who aren't Jewish. And a bus was hit by a rocket. I don't know if anybody was in it at the time. Synagogue was hit by a rocket. These rockets are completely indiscriminate. They hit where they hit, and you can imagine the psychological toll that it takes on the Israeli people. In the southern town of Sderot, which has for 2 decades now been under constant rocket siege. They have underground playgrounds for the children, and a disproportionate number of children there wet their bed still and have psychological issues, because you can imagine what it would do to you every day hearing sirens going off, and because it used to be an everyday thing. For years, it was an everyday thing. Um, And so there's a massive psychological toll and a lot of damage to property. And also firing Iron Dome is incredibly expensive. I heard a few years ago, I don't know what the numbers are today, that every time Israel fires a rocket from Iron Dome, it costs $250,000. Might be more, I don't know. But imagine again, if Israel is firing over 3,000 of those, that's a very expensive thing. So there, but here's what I'll say about Iron Dome too, because I've heard a lot of criticism about Iron Dome, and I will address that later uh, of how it's not fair, if you will, that Israel has this technology in the sky or whatever that can save Israelis and Palestinians don't have that. Um, I think Iron Dome, as many lives in Israel as Iron Dome has saved, it has saved 10 times as many lives of Palestinians. I think whoever, like the person who made Iron Dome, should be given the Nobel Peace Prize. Why is that? Because, like I said, not only has it saved probably thousands of Israeli lives, but imagine if Israel didn't have this technology. What would Israel do if they didn't have this technology? Imagine the ground invasion Israel would do, and imagine the air raids Israel would do if thousands of Israelis were being killed by these rockets. Um, the death toll among the Palestinians would be in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands, and certainly within thousands for Israelis. So this I think personally, again, putting my own bias in here, I think Iron Dome has been the greatest thing to ever happen to the Palestinian as well, in terms of saving lives. So Israel's response to this. So Israel has responded, as we all have seen, with targeted airstrikes in Gaza and leveling 14-story buildings in Gaza and such. And so I want to just kind of, this is the first real big conflict Israel has had with Hamas, uh, which is the organization that's firing these rockets that controls the Gaza Strip. This was the last conflict that Israel had with Hamas was 7 years ago, like major conflict, and that lasted 7 weeks, over 50 days. And um, the death toll from the 2014 conflict ended up being about 2,200 Palestinians and about 73 Israelis, plus one foreign civilian. And in 2008 was the first Gaza war, and that one killed 1,400 Palestinians. And so Israel has, in this operation, accomplished far more this past week, like than it did, according to the Israeli Defense Forces and the Prime Minister and stuff. Israel's accomplished more this past week than it did in the last conflict, with no ground invasion. And Israel has claimed to set Hamas's weapons and everything that they've done back years. And this time, I don't want to use the word only because 217 is still a lot of people. But when you compare, we've so far 217 Palestinians have been killed. And so you can see that it's about 10% of the Palestinians that have been killed, that were killed in the last conflict. And so that, I think, what we're seeing this time is something that is far less horrific than last time, for both sides. And and yeah, and Israel's been able to accomplish their goals more effectively and with less casualties on either side. And there's a lot of debate always between with that number of um, how many are civilians, how many are militants. Um, Hamas claims that the vast majority are civilians. I don't believe that for a second. Israel says that about 150 of these were Hamas militants, and so I don't there's no way of really knowing the exact number, but um, with the bombing operation that Israel has done, to have uh, a figure like this of 217, and at least claim that the vast majority are militants, is, I think, fairly impressive. Again, my own bias. I know that a lot of people will jump down my throat for saying that. Um, but part of what this is too, um, is like, why is there such low numbers? Or again, I hate saying that. That sounds so awkward. Lower numbers than if Israel were just carpet bombing Gaza. Well, Hamas. Um, so the main thing is that Israel gives up the element of surprise by calling and telling security at buildings and stuff, we're going to be bombing this building in 2 hours. Please evacuate your people, everybody in the building. You have 2 hours to do so. And this gives up the element of surprise. And Israel will also do what's called a knock on door or knock on roof technique, where they drop a bomb on a building that doesn't really do damage so much or have anything lethal about it, but it lets people know, like, it shakes the entire building and it lets people know this building is going to get bombed. So Israel has done this a lot, and this is why when you see in the media a perfectly trained camera on a building that's being, leveled by Israel, they know it's going to be leveled because Israel gave up the element of surprise and told them this. Now, does this make it okay? Um, and that's a really debated thing, because sadly, I mean, I'm talking about how great Israel is because this is saving lives, that Israel gives up the element of surprise. Yet a lot of these high-rise buildings house both Hamas militants and Hamas political offices and stuff, and also house civilians who live in them and who are now homeless. And so, and in 2 hours, you don't have time to pull your stuff out of your house. You have time to get out of your house, so that you don't die. And it's uncomfortable, and it's awkward, and it's, you know, but where do I put, Israel's gotten a lot of criticism for this. This is where I put the blame on Hamas. Uh, and again, I'm not going to pretend that I'm not biased, but Hamas purposefully, uh, takes these office buildings and stuff, offices in these high-rise residential apartment buildings, because they know that that will be a deterrent to Israel striking them, or if Israel does strike them, that uh, that it will be a PR nightmare for Israel, which we've seen. That all these Palestinians are losing their homes. And so that's where I put a lot of blame on Hamas. And we've seen times too where Hamas, I can't speak to this conflict specifically, but I know in the past, and it wouldn't shock me if this were the case this time too, where Israel has said, we are bombing this building because you are using it for your military, your terrorist activities, or firing rockets from it or something. Please evacuate everyone. And Hamas has refused to allow civilians to leave those buildings, and has even threatened to kill them if they leave those buildings. And this results ultimately in a sort of victory for Hamas, because if Israel then does not bomb the building because they know there's civilians in it, then Hamas has no losses there. And if they do bomb the building, and there's significant civilian casualties, then Israel, this is a PR nightmare for Israel. I can see a lot of you are putting things in chat. I can't see your chats. I'm not trying to ignore anybody. I just can't see your chats while I'm sharing my screen. But I'll get to them afterwards, I promise. One of the things Israel did this war too, well, and so there's been a lot of questions about the press. We always have questions about bias with the media. Certainly, as a fairly pro-Israel person, I see what I watch CNN, and I see what's on MSNBC and on European stuff, and I find the media to be horribly biased against Israel. And at the same time, I've talked to people who think it's horribly biased in favor of Israel. But there's with one of the buildings that Israel took down was where there was foreign press offices, like Al Jazeera, for instance, and I think it was Reuters, I forget. Um, and Israel claims that those buildings were being used by Hamas for their terrorist activities as well, and that perhaps these journalists even knew that they were sharing building with Hamas for these things. And but it's also raised a lot of questions where there will be investigations about is Israel censoring the press or not by destroying these buildings. Um, and but also where there's been some misinformation coming around too is a little bit strategically on the part of Israel. Last Thursday, I was teaching the Intro to Judaism class I love so much every Thursday, and somebody said, "I see Israel's launching a ground invasion." And I was like, "What? I didn't know Israel was launching a ground invasion." He said, "Well, the media is reporting it, and Israel has confirmed it." And I was like, "Wow, I didn't that escalate. I didn't realize that was going to happen." And what then, what turned out happened was Israel found out that there was this massive, massive tunnel that stretched like over a mile that Hamas called the Metro, that Hamas used to have trap doors in and stuff to capture Israeli soldiers, and also to be able to jump out and fire anti-tank missiles and stuff. And that they were going to use this in case of a ground invasion. And they spent $90 million on this one tunnel, Hamas did. People say, well, the Hamas, the Palestinians in Gaza don't have their own bomb shelters and stuff. Well, maybe ask Hamas why they're spending $90 million on a tunnel when they could be building bomb shelters. So anyhow, um, Israel announced to the media that they were doing a ground invasion and put on their Twitter that they had begun a ground invasion, and all these Hamas fighters, then Hamas called all their fighters into the tunnel, and Israel then bombed the entire length of the tunnel, killing these dozens and dozens and dozens of these Hamas fighters. So now for my opinion, in case I haven't put it in enough. I want to start off by, let me say what I think Israel did wrong. I'll start there. I think that personally, I think that doing this over Ramadan, carrying out the evictions and over Ramadan, and then closing Damascus Gate um, and cutting the mic, the speakers, and having Israeli police go into the Haram al-Sharif were very provocative actions. And I think that could have waited till after Ramadan was over or done before Ramadan occurred. I think Israel was provocative there. And it's not, some of you are going to blow up at me now, but it's not like Israel hasn't done stuff like that before. The pretext for the Second Intifada was Ariel Sharon, who was probably the most hated Israeli by Palestinians of all time, went up to the Dome of the Rock area and in the temple complex with about 200 police officers, and walked around to make a statement that he felt he should have every right to go there. And this was the pretext that started the Second Intifada. So I think Israel could have been less provocative in how they handled that stuff. And also, though, where once Hamas got involved in everything, I 110%, 1,000% support Israel's right to defend its civilians against terror. Um, if one rocket hit San Diego from Mexico, we would go to war with Mexico. Imagine 3,500 rockets in a week hitting the United States, and over 50% of America's population living under air raid sirens. And no country should tolerate that. Rockets being fired indiscriminately. And Israel has a complete right to defend itself from these folks. And so this week I saw a couple of comedians that I normally really enjoy say some things that were just wrong that I wanted to respond to. So first we have Trevor Noah from The Daily Show, and what Trevor Noah said in his monologue was he talked about how uh, he first started talking about the history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and said some things that were not historically accurate at all. But then he, on top of that, compared what's happening to to when he would fight with his younger brothers as a child, and he would and with this he said, my little brothers used to hit me and it would hurt, and so I would beat them up, and my mother would tell me, Trevor, you can't hit your brothers, and I would say, why? They hit me first, and it hurt. And her response would be, um, because Trevor, uh, they're smaller than you, and you're bigger and stronger than them, and therefore you have a responsibility to show restraint. And he compared that to the Israel-Palestinian situation. I think this is a terrible analogy, and here's why. Um, because because Trevor Noah's younger brothers were not firing rockets into his room to murder him. And the argument that we hear from Trevor Noah and John Oliver is basically, in a lot of the international community, is essentially that, well, Israel is bigger and stronger, so they should be showing more restraint, and so on and so forth. And I personally, like I said, if I were living under rocket fire, I would want my country to defend me. Um, so, and I just don't understand that argument. It's like, okay, 13 Israelis were killed, so proportionate response is 13 Palestinians should be killed then. And that just, or, Palestinians launched 3,500 rockets into Israel, so that means Israel should launch 3,500 rockets of equal caliber. I don't understand that logic. But also where I think Trevor Noah and John Oliver get wrong, and so do a lot of folks on both sides of this conflict, is the idea that well, just forgetting that these are human lives. Like it completely breaks my heart to think about what children in Israel are going through, and it completely breaks my heart to know what children in Gaza must be going through, and the horrible, horrible trauma that the children in Gaza must have. But Hamas knows they're not going to defeat Israel with this. They know what they're bringing onto their people with this, and yet they still do it. And I'll talk about that in one moment. But I want to share. All right, let's see. Um, uh, anyways, I see ton of comments in here. Uh, sorry, I'll try and associate first. Thank you. So let me just okay. So I'll get some of these in a second. Um, so let me see. I'm just reading some of your comments. Um, Anyhow, I want to show a video really quickly. I want to make sure I have it up. Had it up like a moment ago. What did I do with it? Hold on. Maybe I accidentally closed it. Let me just pull it up again really fast. 1 second. So here was an Israeli girl's response to John Oliver, and I think this like really kind of sums up well the sort of my views on it, and Israel's responsibility to her citizens. So here, put that up. Oh wait,
Suiza.
me.
Hello, Mr. John Oliver. My name is Renan Abotzer Suiza. I live in Kfaraza and I'm 10 years old. I heard what you say in your show and I want to respond to you.
It is true that militants from Palestinian groups like Hamas fired over 1,000 rockets towards Israel this week, and that is reprehensible. But, and I realise this is the most load-bearing conjunction in history, but the majority of those rockets thankfully didn't reach their target.
Every siren makes me cry and feel sad. Just so you know, my army is strong. However, this does not protect me from being afraid. Since I was born, I live in fear. Since I was 6, I have been going to therapy.
There is a massive imbalance when it comes to the two sides' weaponry and capabilities.
Israel was founded to protect the Jewish nation, and we will be not sorry for being a strong country.
While most of the rockets aimed toward Israeli citizens this week were intercepted, Israel's airstrikes were not. They hit their targets, including a house in a refugee camp, a building housing the Associated Press and Al Jazeera, and this 13-story office and apartment building.
Our country doesn't attack whatever it wants to. However, Hamas attacking for the last 20 years whatever they want to.
Pretty good reminder that while some things are incredibly complex and require a great deal of context, others are just wrong.
I just want it to end. I just want peace, a normal childhood for me and for all the children in Gaza.
So really heartbreaking, but I think more eloquent than anything I could add. In response to that, to the John Olivers and Trevor Noahs who say basically Israel is bigger and stronger, and so they should not be responding. That girl should not be living life like that. That's horrendous. And no country in the world should tolerate their civilians living like that. And I'll get really controversial now, and tell you what I really think this is all about, and it's politics. I don't think Hamas has any care at all about the Palestinians in general. I mean, they but otherwise, again, they would not be. They know perfectly well that firing rockets into Israel is going to result like this. They're not going to destroy Israel, and Israel is far stronger and mightier than they are. But I think this is about Hamas being opportunists, and a little bit of Israel too, to be honest. And not really anything about Sheikh Jarrah. So the man on the left here is Mahmoud Abbas, also known as Abu Mazen, who is the head of the Palestinian Authority, and and he controls the West Bank, and he's considered the more moderate of the Palestinian leadership. U.S. has relations with the Palestinian Authority and recognizes the Palestinian Authority as the legitimate leadership of the Palestinians. Um, and for the Palestinian Authority, they are not Islamists. They are nationalists. In fact, a lot of their leadership are Christians and stuff. And what they claim, even though I don't think is what they actually believe, what they claim is that they want a two-state solution um, of basically 1967 borders. I don't think that that's genuine in what they actually want. But Mahmoud Abbas has many times um, been supposed to have elections and for the Palestinians, and he then delays the elections, postpones them, doesn't have them. And he did this, I think, about a month ago or so. And uh, and there was a lot of frustration among the Palestinians by this. And how Hamas first came into power was after Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip. You know, we had competing narratives. On one hand, Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip for peace and to be able to create peace with the Palestinians and make this gesture towards peace. And this came at the tail end of the Second Intifada. And and what Hamas said was this this isn't Israel withdrawing for peace. This is Israel retreating from our suicide bombings and all this. Um, and so anyhow, um, that's what Hamas claimed, was that their resistance was working. And in the following winter, the Palestinians held elections and Hamas won those elections. And then in a bloody coup took over the Gaza Strip, and the Palestinian Authority took control of the West Bank. And so Abu Mazen and his party have a fair amount of insecurity and weakness. And this was an opportunity for Hamas to say, look, we are standing up for the Palestinian people. We are fighting the occupiers and such. And at the same time, and with Hamas on the other hand, they are an Islamist terrorist organization that is that is driven by religious and extremist ideology, and has in their charter a genocidal charter to destroy the state of Israel. And the worst thing that could happen for Hamas is peace between the Israelis and Palestinians, because, like I said, their objective, and when you see these people who claim to be pro-Palestinian protesters, and they have an entire map of Israel and the Palestinian territories draped in the Palestinian flag, they're not pro-Palestinian. They're anti-Israel, like, period. They are saying Israel shouldn't exist. And my honest opinion on Prime Minister Netanyahu, he says what's convenient for him in the moment. He will talk out of every corner of his mouth. And I don't think, is truly interested or committed to a two-state solution with the Palestinians. And his primary focus, especially right now, is staying in power, because he is facing corruption charges. And as soon as he is no longer prime minister, he is likely going to jail, or certainly standing trial. And in the last couple of years, Israel has had 4 elections because they've been unable to form a coalition government. And within Israel, there have been massive anti-Netanyahu protests that have been going on every single week for at least a year, where my friends from Tel Aviv, who say that they would never step foot in Jerusalem, when I lived in Jerusalem, they refused to come and visit me because they love Tel Aviv. And, there's this big rivalry between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And yet they have gone every single week to Jerusalem to protest and say that Netanyahu needs to go. And Netanyahu kind of just, I think, figured that he could indefinitely delay, being removed from office, since there were no coalitions being formed. And Then a couple weeks ago, something really scary for Netanyahu happened, which was that the right-wing parties, led by like Naftali Bennett and even some of the Orthodox parties and stuff, came and talked to the left-wing, center-left parties and the left-wing parties, including Meretz and primarily a party called Yesh Atid, and then even started to talk to the Arab parties. And they basically said, we all have one thing in common, and that's believing that Netanyahu must go. And we are willing to create this totally dysfunctional government of Orthodox, right wing, secular, and left wing, and even Arab parties potentially, in order to force Netanyahu out of office, and then our country can start to move on, and we can figure all this out in a couple of years. Well, I think for Hamas, the prospects of having a potentially left-wing prime minister in Israel are terrifying, because this is somebody who might try to do the work that Yitzhak Rabin was doing. And I mean, this is again just my opinion. And so they once what we have seen in the political history of Netanyahu is every time Hamas has started violence, um, Netanyahu has Israelis have turned to Netanyahu as a safe and secure response to that violence. He was first elected prime minister in 1996 when everybody thought Shimon Peres was going to be elected prime minister to succeed Rabin after his assassination. And in the month leading up to the election, Hamas carried out terrorist attack after terrorist attack after terrorist attack, and Israelis shockingly went right wing and voted for Netanyahu and elected him prime minister. And then after he was no longer prime minister, in the 2006 elections in Israel, Netanyahu got absolutely shellacked. And I remember a prominent Israeli newspaper saying that this was going to mean the death of Netanyahu's political career. He was done, he was over. And Netanyahu had become particularly prominent because he quit Ariel Sharon's party, government, when he and Ariel Sharon were part of the same party, because he was adamantly opposed to the Gaza withdrawal and said, this is the worst idea ever. Hamas will take over Gaza Strip and will put all of Israel in danger. And everybody thought after this, Netanyahu's political career was dead and over. And then, lo and behold, in December of 2008, we had the first Gaza war and thousands of rockets pummeling Israel. And Netanyahu basically got to say, I told you so. And a few months later was once again became the prime minister of Israel. And at times when it's looked like his political career was in danger, like a few years ago, it looked like he was going to lose about 5 years ago, election to Bougie Herzog. He used some anti-Arab dog whistles and was able to bring Israelis out, kind of out of fear, to elect him. So I think that a lot of so once this conflict began with Hamas and Israel over the past couple of weeks, we have seen all of a sudden Naftali Bennett, the right-wing person who was going to partner with the left-wing folks, say, I can't partner with the left-wing folks anymore, and I certainly cannot partner with Arab parties, and go back to Netanyahu. And so I think that this is a lot about politics, and a lot about, frankly, Hamas's opportunism. So those are kind of my opinions and my assessment of what's going on. I hope it was helpful. I'm sure that not everybody agreed with everything I said, but that's kind of how I see it and understand what's going on. And going back to the human element of things, is going back to the human element of everything. Um, this is a sad time. It's sad and it's hard and it's disappointing to me, because these are real people. These are on both sides who are being victimized, again, I believe, by Hamas. But I remember when Israel had the second Lebanon war in 2006. I was living in Seattle, my hometown, and a man walked into the Jewish Federation building of Greater Seattle and shouted, "I hate Israel," and shot 6 people. Um, and just today in Beverly Hills, we saw anti-Israel hooligans go and beat up pro-Israel people and attack them, and throwing rocks and stuff through a kosher diner and everything, in West Hollywood and in Beverly Hills. And of course, this week here we saw the Chabad Center have a swastika carved into it. And so uh, it's really, I remember walking through my college campus in college wearing my kippah, and a guy coming up to me and shouting, "Get the hell out of Palestine." And I'm like, dude, I'm in La Jolla. Like, what are you talking about? And unfortunately, I think that the anti-Semites of the world use this as an opportunity to exercise their anti and justify their anti-Semitism, and don't distinguish between Jewish people and the Israeli government. And I feel for the Muslim community too. I reached out to the Muslim community and said, can we issue a joint statement saying, hey, let's keep the conflict over there and not uh, have our centers of worship attacked, or innocent Muslim people here or innocent Jewish people here attacked because of what's going on over there. And I was sad they didn't get back to me. I mean, that's been a tough thing I've been dealing with this week too, is folks who I consider allies or people I've tried to help, you know, saying or doing things that are hurtful. Um, so anyways, that's kind of where I'm at. I thank you for being here. I have a good 25, 30 minutes. I've talked for an hour straight now. So I would love to hear how you're feeling and doing. Like I said, in 25 minutes, I don't think we have the ability for all of us to be able to share our perspective on the conflict or get in fights with each other. Yeah, to what Vivian just said, I will say that's been a hard thing for me too, is seeing how a lot of young people are, disengaging with Israel. And I've heard that a lot of our young people have received anti-Semitic remarks at their schools and stuff like this, or been asked to be the spokespeople for the Israeli government and defend what's going, explain Israel's actions and stuff. It's been a tough week to be a Jew. I was going to say a Jew in the diaspora, but as tough as it is to be a Jew in diaspora, I'd appreciate being a Jew in the diaspora more than being a Jew in Israel this week. Very last thing I'll say, then I just want to hear how you're doing and how I can support you. Is I've been promoting along with Laura this trip to Israel in December, and people are going, "Oh, is that still going on? Or is it safe to go?" Again, I'll share my opinion. I think that Israel has been so effective this past week and a half in their operation, past 2 weeks in their operation, that I highly suspect, unless something catastrophic happens, like a school full of children gets a direct hit and a whole bunch of children die or something, I strongly suspect that in the next week, I think very likely, potentially before Shabbat, um, Israel and Hamas will agree to a ceasefire. I know the international community and now the U.S. is pushing for one, and Israel said that they've accomplished a lot of their goals. This is certainly not going to be the 7-week conflict that we saw in 2014. It's not going to last that long, and most definitely will be over long before December. Like I said, I think it's going to wrap up in the next week. And um, and so what I would say in terms of visiting Israel is two things. I think it is the safest time to go to Israel, because if this conflict had not just happened and Hamas is getting their butt kicked and is saying, we want a ceasefire, we want a ceasefire, we want a ceasefire. And Prime Minister Netanyahu last week said, and I largely agree with him, is uh, is if we don't finish what we've started now, we're just going to have to do it again in 6 months or a year. We're going to knock Hamas's rockets back years. So I actually feel safer going to Israel this December than I would have had this conflict not taken place, because now I can say with a lot of confidence that Hamas is not going to have the rocket stockpile to do this come December. And the other thing I would say is Israel, this is going to scare off a lot of people from visiting Israel, which has already been hit really hard due to the pandemic and the tourist industry. And I would say that visiting Israel is one of the best things you can do to help. It is uh, a way to help the people. It's a way to help the economy. I'm actually, every time I go to, and here's what I'm doing, every time I go to Israel, I for work, like I'm leading a trip or something, I try and go a few days early to get over jet lag so that I can like be with it and be present for folks. I'm going a few days early and I'm staying in Hebron and Ramallah and going to go and hear the Palestinian perspective is my plan if it's safe. Um, so go to Israel and hear perspectives from people and ask what it's like, because I had a young Jewish person this week who's, said, I don't know if I want to go to Israel anytime soon because I have some disagreements with what Israel is doing from what I'm hearing in the media. And so I don't want to support Israel. And I was like, well, you're hearing just one side. Isn't it important to go and to be informed by talking to people who actually live there, as opposed to John Oliver and Trevor Noah? So again, those are my perspectives. I got a good 20 minutes or so now, and I would love to just hear how you're doing and how I can be supportive to you. Thank you. Anybody want to start, or anybody want to put something in the chat? Or if not, we can just call it a night. I won't force anybody here.
If I could start,
Please.
I put some stuff in the well, I sent you some messages privately, I think, but what I've noticed, and this is partly because I'm really active on social media, but a lot of people I thought were friends have kind of turned on me and said, essentially, if you support Israel, like, I no longer want to be your friend. And I've been very clear that I'm a Zionist in the past, but it seems like this particular conflict, that's happening right now, has really ignited a lot of anti-Semitism. And I'm not sure how to even engage with people and kind of try to both like not take on too much myself, but also like feel like I'm making some kind of difference. It just feels like I'm shouting into the void, if that makes sense.
That's tough. Thank you. That sounds really really painful. And I think it's hard when so I'll tell you one of the reasons I left Seattle, where I grew up, a place I love. Some of you will laugh at this. I was considered like the extreme right-wing guy in Seattle. What I found was that there are a lot of people on the far left who really like sympathize with the Palestinian cause, as do I, by the way. I don't sympathize with violence, but I sympathize with the Palestinian cause. There are some people out there who say, I'm so liberal and open-minded that if you don't agree with me, then you're closed-minded. And that's not open-mindedness. So I'm sorry that you're dealing with closed-minded people. That sounds really hard. Art, you unmuted yourself. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, I'd like to. just basically following up on what Sarah said, I think that's a good reason that this ceasefire should be put in place immediately. That this situation is tragic and regrettable. And I agree with you, Rabbi. There is an unfortunate political element to it. And I also agree with you, Rabbi, that I think Israel was unnecessarily provocative with its actions, taking advantage of and stirring up the pot in that neighborhood with the evictions and that type of thing, which seems to be more threatening in a bigger picture than has been presented in terms of how many people are in Jerusalem or might be losing their homes. If Hamas's response was like to get out of East Jerusalem, it was ridiculous, or there'd be consequences. And to start the bombing at that point, obviously, was predictable. But I don't see if they've accomplished their purposes largely on the ground and minimize the damage, which I think is admirable, as you pointed out, then why not stop while you're ahead, so to speak, and try to recover some sympathy from the world. Because it's just getting worse and more violence, more bombing, the more danger, the more killing, the worse it looks and the more harmful it is for everybody. It just needs to stop now.
I appreciate what you're saying.
That was my initial feeling of this thing, and as I don't have anywhere near the information or background or experience that you do, Rabbi, and I really appreciate what you said quite a bit, because you know much more about it than I do. And thank you for having this forum, and because it does give me some sense. I don't know how many people from outside are listening, but I've been in a loss to talk to other people about it, because I didn't really think it was defensible. And frankly, I still don't think it's defensible what Israel's doing. So I'll just close there.
Well, thank you, Art. Sounds like we agree on some things, disagree on some other things, but I can appreciate that it can sometimes be a hard thing when, for us as Jews, when we maybe don't feel like Israel's meeting our values, living up to our values. What I'll say is, I don't have all the information Israel has, so I don't know if they feel they've accomplished their objective. But there is one thing, that I guess what's so frustrating and so hard is kind of like a point you touched on, that the world always comes down on Israel. And it's like, well, can we do something to get some get some of this ill will off of our back? Because I know that tomorrow the United Nations is going to pass a resolution that's condemning Israel and putting all the blame on Israel. And so I kind of reflect back to a quote that was on a room in my high school, which was, the right thing's not always popular and the popular thing's not always right. And so, I guess I hope Israel will do the right thing. And even if it's not popular among their own people, or they'll do the right thing even if it's not popular among the world, and make that determination. We'll see what happens. Thank you. I saw Leah was going to say something, and then Jan, and then Quinn.
So I live in Israel for 20 years. I was a nurse active in 6 days war in Milchemet Atasha. After this, I was a nurse in the north of Israel when we was attacked in 73. Infiltration was every night from Lebanon. Open bunker is every day. And every time they promised the same kind of a peace. But I don't think so in the tap, and it's been the imperial, the big people, that is not you, and it's not me, and it's not Netanyahu, it's on top. They want this fight to continue. If it's not here, it's got to be there. So my belief is to live together, and it's why I went to Israel. And I believe to live together. But what bothers me now in this moment is that Israel was not enough alert what happened inside Israel with the Arab inside Israel. Because most of the time, in many words, the town in Israel was quiet. If the government told them, we defend everybody, Israeli, Palestine, Cherkessim, Sunni, wherever Christian, they was quiet. Maybe you have one, two, three people that lift the head, but the rest, no. Continue the life and believe. In fact, you have Bedouin that volunteer in the army. You have I don't Drusim. Drusim, they service in the army
Yes.
and they volunteer and they don't want to change this. And Bedouin too. So the point here now, I ask you how we can defend ourselves outside Israel against attack.
Yeah.
I was in Hashomer Hatzair, I was active because Hashomer Hatzair was part of the Mossad, if you want to know, in South America, in 65, in 63, in 62, when the Nazis attacked Jewish and put bomb in the synagogue. So we was the defense. So I wanted now, in my age 77, I want to ask you how we defend ourselves now. I know who I am. I am Jewish. I'm proud to be Jewish. And if they come to me, I know how to react. And I teach my children in this way. I don't need to, to make a flag to say I'm Jewish.
Thank you.
Want to defend ourselves against the people that don't believe in us and they don't want us, and to defend ourselves against the Jewish very extremists that they don't know anything, that they stopped me in the airport to be in the line because the airport of Israel is for them. Come on.
I hear you. Thank you. Thank you also for your,
I want to answer how we can
yeah. So,
prepare ourselves.
yeah. So, I appreciate your question and appreciate, by the way, your service to the state of Israel during those wars. So my thoughts on that are, I mean, it's hard. It's not, there's no way to fully, prevent everything, but we're making a lot of security upgrades to our building and stuff every day. I've been on the phone with Chief Brown, the chief of police from of Salt Lake City, and also we've been talking to the FBI every day and analyzing, make sure everything's safe for us. And all those people have been great. My opinion on this is, this is what I shared after the Pittsburgh shooting, the Pittsburgh Tree of Life shooting, was that individual who walked into that synagogue and opened fire, he knew he was not going to kill every Jewish person, but his goal was to end Judaism, I think, by making us afraid to go to the synagogue. And everybody who then came to Cole and me afterwards was doing active resistance and active defiance. And I think back to the story of Masada, where the Jews, as they were about to kill themselves, shouted from the top of Masada, "Masada will never fall again." And those were their last words. And today, when the IDF is commissioned into when the soldiers are enlisted and they finish their training and everything and get sworn in as full soldiers, they don't walk, they run up Mount Masada and they stand on the edge of Mount Masada and shout in billowing voices, "Masada will never fall again." And I think a lot of it for us, I forget if it was Golda Meir who said that our greatest weapon is our intellect. And so it can be hard to defend ourselves. We're taking every security measure and precaution we can. but I think a lot of it needs to be a mindset, a mentality of making sure that we as a people stay together. We read in the Talmud is Kol Yisrael Arvim Zeh Lezeh. Every Jew is responsible for one another, and so I think the greatest threat to ourselves during all this is letting fear or letting displeasure or something like this divide us and not staying united as a community. But it's tough. I wish I had a better answer for you. I know there are a couple more people. We have limited time, and there were a couple more people who had things they wanted to share. So I want to go Jan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. I wanted to share with Quinn that they wrote some things that really resonated with me, and that is about buzzwords and people who normally do a lot of research. And I have friends who are throwing around things like US imperialism and Zionist apartheid. And my frustration is I don't feel well enough informed, as there are people on this forum today who obviously know quite a bit, and I've learned quite a bit, but I don't feel well informed enough to respond. I'm not going to do that on social media anyway, but what are some, Quinn, that just really was like, yeah, that's what's happening in my world. And what would be some, there's a million resources out there. I could look at the New York Times. Is there something that you would suggest that all of us look at to bring us up to speed? I don't know my Israeli history.
There's so many great resources, great organizations out there, and that have different slants, different biases, left wing, right wing. I read a lot of Israeli newspapers. Some I'll put in the chat, and if others have other ones, please put them in the chat. I read Ynet News a good bit, which is a kind of I find to be kind of centrist. Then there's Jerusalem Post, which is a little more right wing, and Haaretz, which is a bit more left wing. And so I get different Israeli perspectives from those different sources. And so Times of Israel is another great one. Thank you, Matthew. Great Times of Israel. Those are, I think, reading newspapers and hearing different perspectives is helpful. I remind myself of what Pirkei Avot says, which is ask the question, who is wise? And the answer is the one who can learn from everyone. That's what I think we need to do more as a world, is to listen and hear. I used to be so sure that Israel could do no wrong in my eyes. And then I started to hear from Palestinian friends of mine and others, and it gave me a different perspective. And sometimes I am able to say, I don't think Israel was handled as the best that they could have, like I said tonight, about some things. But other times I say, I totally agree with Israel on this, and I see another perspective. And so a great example of that is it has a million names to it, but the security barrier between the West Bank and Jerusalem especially, which is this giant concrete wall. I say security barrier, which is already a charged term, because some people would say separation fence, some people would say apartheid wall, some people would, there's, depending on your view of this, there's a million different terms you could use. And with that, like I said, I'm planning to go to the West Bank. And I said, I'd like to go to Ramallah, and I'd like to go to Jericho, and I'd like to go to Hebron. Those aren't very far apart, 20 miles maybe here or there. And what used to be a half-hour journey is now a 3-hour journey or something, because of this, security barrier, whatever you call it. And I hear how that inconveniences Palestinians and really makes them feel degraded. And there's so many issues there where, as I hear their side, I go, oh my gosh, this thing is terrible and horrible. And I talk to my Israeli friends at the same time, who tell me about how in 2003, 2004, they couldn't go to cafes or restaurants or ride the bus. Or if their families were going out shopping, mom would say, I'm going to take one kid and go to the post office. Tell dad, you take the other kid and go to the grocery store. That way, in case one of those places is bombed, the whole family won't die. And that ugly, horrible wall makes it so we don't have to live that way anymore. We don't have to be terrorized, and we don't have to be afraid of being blown up when we sit at a cafe. And so I hear both of those sides of the story, and they're both right and they're both valid. And I think that big thing we can do is explore each other's narrative. And unfortunately, when I see again the people who claim to be pro-Palestinian, who are not pro-Palestinian because they are completely silent about Hamas's crimes against their own people, who are completely silent about the Palestinian Authority's embezzlement of their people's funds, and who are completely silent about the way that the Lebanese government treats the Palestinians who are living there in Lebanon. And I can give a million more examples, but then they only criticize Israel, and they have an entire flag, like Palestinian flag, draped over the entire country of Israel. I hear from those folks that they aren't interested in hearing my narrative. And that's very painful. Quinn, I had seen that you had unmuted yourself to say something, and then I think we might have to wrap up. But I'd welcome the opportunity to talk to any all of you. Quinn, how you doing, my friend?
Yeah, I don't know that it's adding much, but it is the kind of the social media leftist. I mean, I've just recently come out of undergrad. I've been kind of in that world. The buzzwords and the using the kind of manipulative twisting of a moral argument. This isn't new, but I don't know if it's just because I can't talk face to face to people or something, but something that I've noticed with this is that there can be no discussion with a lot of people. There's, even saying, it's not even getting to the point of like, actually, this is what I think, this is what I'm saying is happening. Actually, you're wrong. It's saying like, that newspaper publication is suspect. You've gotten your information from a Twitter thread. That's suspect. I was told that I shouldn't be talking about anti-Semitism because it would make people think that you weren't allowed to. I don't know. It was a whole thing. I stopped engaging pretty soon,
Yeah.
but that's been, I think, that one of the things that's struck me is that there's these people who I had trusted to be thoughtful and caring are refusing to consider that they might have bad information, and then are being violent at people who suggest that they do.
I appreciate what you're saying so much, and I can relate to that. And I know my wife has had to deal with that this week. I unfriended 2 people from Facebook this week, and let me tell you something though. I don't unfriend people ever for disagreeing with me or because they have a different viewpoint than me. Like, that's silly if we can't hear different viewpoints or whatever. And when I do disagree with somebody, I want to hear what they have to say. A lot of you shared your opinions with me about the Black Lives Matter movement. I certainly have very strong disagreements on their take on this conflict. But I had a woman who just unprovoked trespassed in my yard today and just for 20 minutes bit my head off about that's not fair. I'll say intensely engaged with me about a Black Lives Matter sign I have in front of my house. But I was able to listen to her and she listened to me, and we had a respectful conversation, even though she was a little heated. And I think that's important for us to be able to discuss and stuff. Where I kind of draw the line, and I'll tell you what these to people that I unfriended is I have great interest in hearing views that differ from my own. They make me a better person, more informed person and stuff. And we need to be able to hear those things. What I don't have tolerance for is spewing hatred. And that this one guy who's Jewish has been posting horrific things about Israel all week. And the final straw for me and anybody who says anything to him would say the most degrading, horrible things to, and talking them down, and walking around the things that they said, not acknowledging them but cutting them down. And what the final straw for me with him was when he was saying, um, he talked about the number of Palestinian children that allegedly have been killed by Israel from some source he found, and his response to that was, Israel has committed 3 Sandy Hook murders this week or something, or 2 Sandy Hooks this week. And I was just like, that's ugly and disgusting. And what you are doing is you're comparing Israel defending her citizens um, to a guy who walked into a school with the purpose of murdering kindergartners and doing that on purpose. So anyhow, that really, I was like, and he had posted so many other things where I was like, you aren't promoting peace, you're not promoting discussion, and when people try and discuss with you, you're being rude and mean, and and you're spreading hatred. And I had to ask myself, we call these people our friends on Facebook or whatever. I was like, do I want to be friends with somebody like this? I'll be friends with people who have different opinions than me, but do I want to be friends with someone like this? And the answer was no, I don't. So let's try on our part not to be those people. I will tell you, I used to be one of those people who, 15 years ago, I remember getting in somebody's face and screaming at them about the Palestinians and stuff. And I'm like, am I really portraying Israel in the best way here? And can I not listen to this person's experiences, even if they differ from my own? I'll tell you, most Palestinians I've met, I really, really like, good people. And so I pray and hope that everybody will find some peace. I have to run to a board meeting, so I apologize. But I want to thank you so much for coming out. I think we could talk about this all night. You're welcome to email me, and like I said, tell me what I got wrong, tell me what I got right. But I just hope that we all pray for peace. Something I said in my statement the other day that I believe strongly to be true is that the Israel that we're seeing now is not what the situation in Israel we're seeing now is not what any Jew, Christian, or Muslim, I think, wants in Israel. And I hope that the children in Sderot and Ashdod and Ashkelon, Beersheba, and Tel Aviv, and all these places can go to bed and sleep peacefully and not have to live in bomb shelters like they've had to. And I hope that the children in Gaza as well can grow up to be happy, normal kids. And that's not happening. And so I pray for peace over there. And, at the same time, pray that Hamas will stop torturing their own citizens for their own means to an end. All right, everybody. Thank you. Appreciate you. Be well, and please don't hesitate to tell me how I can support you as your rabbi. That's the greatest privilege I have. Take care.